Welcome to Never Again is Now, a podcast about anti-Semitism. I am Evelyn Marcus, and in addition to being a psychologist, I'm featured in the documentary about anti-Semitism, Never Again is Now. I am a Dutch Jew and the daughter of Holocaust survivors. In 2006, I immigrated to the United States because of the rising anti-Semitism in Europe.
I am Phyllis Zimbler Miller, the founder of the free nonfiction Holocaust theater project, ThinEdgeOfTheWedge.com. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest of the United States, where our parents and grandparents had escaped Tsarist Russia and Poland the century before this one. But in 1970, only 25 years after the end of World War II, my U.S. Army officer husband and I were stationed in Munich, Germany. This changed our lives forever.
This month of January 2022, the book The Betrayal of Anne Frank, An Investigation, was published. The book has generated considerable controversy due to the book's conclusion that a fellow Dutch Jew revealed the hiding place of the Frank family to the Nazis. To discuss this topic, we have the honor and privilege to discuss this cold case investigation with the leading expert in Holocaust studies in the Netherlands, Johannes Houwink ten Cate. Johannes Houwink ten Cate was born in 1956 and is Professor Emeritus of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam. He has published extensively on the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands and the persecution of the Jews. He is the author, co-author, editor, and co-editor of more than 15 academic books and reports. His latest American book, The Secret Diary of Arnold Douwes, Rescue in the Occupied Netherlands, co-edited with Professor Bob Moore, was published in Dutch and English. Yad Vashem will do a translation into Hebrew. Professor Houwink ten Cate, welcome to our show, and thank you so much for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
I get to ask the first question. We'd like to learn about your personal connection to your work. Why did you decide to focus your career on Holocaust studies? Is there, other than professional reasons, a personal reason?
I started doing research on the persecution of the Jews in the occupied Dutch territories some 30 years ago. At that time, in Holland and also elsewhere in Europe, a new generation of non-Jewish Holocaust researchers came to the fore because the first predominantly Jewish generation of Holocaust scholars retired. This marked the further internationalization of this particular type of research. In the 50s, Holocaust research in the 60s only took place in what we at that moment in time called the Free West. After the fall of the wall, Holocaust research sprung up in other Eastern European states than Poland and Hungary, where traditionally the Holocaust was researched against the wish of the Soviet Union. Now, Holocaust research takes place all over the world, but it's different from other parts or fields of modern history, because usually in modern history, we are dealing with a surplus of sources. There are so many sources that we cannot find time to study all of them. Holocaust history is different, because the final stage of genocide usually is its denial by the perpetrators, which in this case meant that very many documents on the Holocaust were destroyed by the Nazi authorities. And in the Dutch case, this percentage is as high as 95%. That means that we form an internationalized and multidisciplinary group of scholars who study a very small percentage of the documents which has been available at one moment in time. And it's a multilingual research exercise as well. And it's becoming more and more international and more multilingual because if you want to get it right, you would, of course, after the fall of the wall, also need to have you need a very good knowledge of German. You need English. You would preferably also be able to read Yiddish. And if you would want to do work on Eastern Europe, then you would also need to read Russian, Polish, Hungarian. So it's becoming a very international field, but we are severely limited by the fact that so many documents have been destroyed. If we would have more documents, say in the Dutch case, we would simply have to, we could open a carton box and take a piece of paper with the name of the person who did the betrayal of the Anne Frank family, show the paper in front of a television camera, and the work would be done. And unfortunately, our life is not as easy as I just described.
Thank you. So let's move on to the book. After 6 years of investigation, a cold case team of 30 professionals with different disciplines came to the conclusion that Anne Frank and her family were most probably portrayed by a member of the Jewish Council. First, could you explain to our listeners the role of the Jewish Council during the German occupation of Holland, which was similar to the Nazi set up Jewish councils in other occupied countries?
Yeah, although there are also differences between Jewish councils. To begin with, there's not a direct connection between Jewish councils and deportations. There are regions in Eastern Europe where deportations and mass killings take place, although there's not a Jewish council. And the role of the Jewish councils, which, as you know, was severely debated, beginning by Hannah Arendt's famous book on the Eichmann trial in 1963. The role of the councils changed over time. So in the Dutch case, the Jewish Council first simply was a channel of communication between the local Nazi authorities in Amsterdam and the Amsterdam Jewish community, which at that time counted approximately 60,000 men, women, and children.
How many? Could you repeat that number?
60,000.
60,000.
So every 10th inhabitant of Amsterdam was a Jew.
Ooh.
What's specific about Amsterdam Jewry is that so many of them were very poor. There was a very large proletariat living in the former ghetto, which not was officially a ghetto, but in practice was a ghetto in the sense that very many of its inhabitants were Jewish. In some streets, the majority of the inhabitants would be Jewish in the center of Amsterdam. Now, it became forbidden for Jews to have direct contacts with either German civil servants or with the Dutch civil servants, which meant that if you wanted something or if you needed something, you would need the council to act as your intermediary. That's actually how the council started. First only in Amsterdam, and then starting in October 1941, the council appointed representatives in all the towns in the Netherlands where Jews were living in 1941. So then in practice, the Amsterdam Jewish Council simply became the Dutch Jewish Council. There was, from the point of view of personnel of the council, there was a strong continuity. Very many people who acted as representatives of the council, either in Amsterdam or outside of Amsterdam, had been the local chairpersons of the Jewish community in the smaller cities and towns. Later still, the influence of the council extended as Jews were more and more marginalized and became the victims of social exclusion. That meant that Jewish children, for instance, were not allowed to go to schools with non-Jews. And Frank, as you know, went to a Jewish secondary school. If you were to fall ill, you would be brought to a hospital specific for Jewish patients, where Jewish doctors would take care of you, Jewish doctors who no longer had permission to take care of non-Jewish patients. Now, because of these processes of segregation and marginalization and exclusion, at the end of the day, the council organized hospitals and schools up to a point that practically all forms of Jewish social life took place under the umbrella of the Jewish Council. That in one way made the Jewish Council an influential organization. On the other hand, the people who were running the council were, well, they were as vulnerable as all other Jews. So it was clear to everybody involved in the operation of what in time turned out to be a bureaucratic apparatus, to everybody, it must have been perfectly clear that it would be a very difficult job, that it would involve a lot of criticism also coming from Jews, but that the work was necessary from the point of view of organizing Jewish social life. If there had been no council, there would have been no hospitals, no schools. Who would have taken care of the sick? Who would have taken care of the children? So as time developed, more and more people became dependent upon the council. This, you have to remember that although the council was influential, it did not operate in the context of a ghetto, as Eastern European Jewish councils operated in the context of ghettos, which made the inhabitants, the Jewish inhabitants of the ghettos, say of Warsaw, way more dependent upon the council than Amsterdam Jewry ever was. Because in Warsaw, you would not be able to rent an apartment without permission of the Jewish council. You would not be able to find a job if it was not for the council. So specifically in ghettos, the influence of councils on Jewish life was even larger than it was in the Dutch case.
Thank you for that explanation about Jewish councils and their role in general. Back to the book. The cold case team assumes the traitor of the Frank family had a list of hiding addresses with Anne Frank's hiding address on it, and that this list was kept at the Jewish Council of Amsterdam. The book states that the member of the Jewish Council traded this information with the Nazis for his own exemption from deportation. Is this a plausible scenario?
No, Evelyn, most certainly this is not a plausible scenario. I very much doubt whether lists with names and addresses of Jews who had gone into hiding ever existed in one of the numerous offices of the Amsterdam Jewish Council. After all, you need to be aware of the fact and not forget that the Jewish Council was an institution which had to work according to the Nazi rules and regulations. Going into hiding was not legal at all, and it was, as was widely believed, punishable with the death sentence. So illegal work and going into hiding is another side of the Jewish reality of living in Amsterdam. And it's in stark contrast to the legality and the legal approach of which the council had to take in order to play its role in Jewish social life, as I just explained to you. Now, the very respectable Jewish notary public, who now is pinpointed by the cold case research team, did not even need to trade information with the Nazis because he had gone into hiding himself. The evidence that he has done this, that he has gone into hiding many months prior to the betrayal of the Anne Frank family, that evidence is truly overwhelming.
So that really gives reasons two important reasons that the Jewish Council would never have such a list.
No, exactly.
And that the alleged traitor was already in hiding.
It didn't need, actually, it would have been pretty stupid for him to come out of hiding, then trade the information. And then there's another thing. The Jewish Council was dissolved in September 1943. The betrayal took place in September 44. If there were people working at the Jewish Council aware of the fact that the Anne Frank family had gone into hiding in the secret annex at the Prinsengracht, why did these people wait for 1 year? That's something which the cold case team also needs to explain. So there are no lists which they mention. There's a time gap between the end of the Jewish Council and the betrayal of the family. And it doesn't make sense to pinpoint allegations in the direction of the perfectly respectable Arnold van den Berg, because Arnold van den Berg was in hiding for many months prior to the betrayal of the Anne Frank family, and he would have only drawn the attention of the Nazi police to him had he come out of hiding in order to pinpoint the Anne Frank family. So it's an unbelievable and not very plausible scenario to, well, to put it mildly and to remain polite. Yeah.
Yes, so the conclusions of this cold case study are not very credible, it seems.
No.
Phyllis.
And what about other studies of the betrayal of Anne Frank? What were the conclusion of these? And do you have any theories about who the traitor might have been?
Well, there have been two official police investigations of the betrayal of the Frank family. There was one more superficial police investigation in 1948, and there was another more thorough investigation in 1964. There were suspects, but there was not hard evidence against these suspects. The Jewish notary public's name came up during the 1964 investigation, but at that time, the police detective doing the investigation concluded, I quote, "there was no need to doubt his integrity," unquote. It's painful, but it also needs mentioning that the respectable notary public, now crucified by the cold case team, died of throat cancer in 1950. So he actually never had the opportunity to defend himself. So unfortunately, also due to lack of sufficient documents, I don't think that we will ever find out who did the betrayal of the Anne Frank family. On the other hand, I've done this research for quite some time, now close to 40 years. I've learned never to say never. If somebody tells me a war story which does not contain any elements seen by me as incredible, then the story is untrue. It's the fact that it's, in my view, contains elements which I find difficult to believe that makes most war stories, which are told to me, actually true. The reality of war and occupation is much more multifaceted than my fantasy. So who knows? We could have another conversation in, say, a year or a month or 6 months from now on the same topic, and we would come to another conclusion. That is something which you cannot exclude.
Right. The conclusion of the cold case investigation that Anne Frank's traitor was probably a Jew received a lot of criticism from you and other Holocaust historians, especially in the Dutch media and also I've seen that reflected in the Jewish media in the United States, not in the mainstream media. The publisher of the book in the Netherlands now apologizes for upsetting people with this painful conclusion without enough proof. They have postponed the second edition. How often were Jews who were in hiding in the Netherlands during the Holocaust betrayed? And were many of the traitors Jews?
Now I have to give you some numbers. All in all, in the beginning of 1941, there were 140,000 Jews in the occupied Dutch territories. Now, out of these 140,000 Jews who were living in the occupied Netherlands, approximately 25,000 Jews went into hiding. So that's roughly, say, 15%. That is not a very high percentage. That points to a marked lack of solidarity with the Jews. It was difficult, perhaps in particular for the Amsterdam Jewish proletariat, which did not have any money at all, to come into a situation in which you could go underground, because it's evident that you needed material goods in order to keep your family alive, even if the non-Jewish people who take care of you wouldn't ask that much. I mean, over time, food shortages became rampant in the Netherlands. Food became expensive. Of course, the people who went underground in July 42, they never would have guessed that their period underground would have lasted close to 3 years before the Nazi occupation ended. One of the two chairmen of the Jewish Council, Bram Ascher, when asked how long the war would take, said 6 weeks max. In situations which are as complicated and miserable as they were at that moment in time for Amsterdam and Dutch Jewry in general, it is logical that people tended to be over optimistic, and that they were unaware that they would have to remain in hiding for so long. Now, out of the 25,000 Jews who went into hiding, between 8,000 and 10,000 of these fugitives on the run for authorities, because that's what downtrodden Jews actually were arrested in their hiding places and deported to death camps. So 1 in 3 Jews who had gone into hiding became the victim of betrayal or other causes which made German or Dutch police officers to arrest him or her. Now, hundreds of Jews were betrayed by a very small number of Jewish professional betrayers who had been pressured by Dutch policemen to find Jews. In German, these people are called Greifer, and which means that to catch somebody. Now, in my mind, these people who were forced to do this work were under duress. They were threatened with deportation and death themselves. The real criminals were the Dutch policemen who ran these Jewish informers, and they were but few. After the liberation, these totally immoral Dutch policemen were severely punished. Often they were executed. At that moment in time, we had a rather soft-hearted queen by the name of Juliana, and Juliana was willing to consider to pardon people who had been given the death penalty, but even the soft-hearted queen we had at that moment in time didn't have any qualms about having these hoodlums executed. There was no way they would be pardoned by anybody involved in the Dutch legal system at the time.
So, Professor, of the Dutch betrayers of the Dutch Jews in hiding, what was the proportion you think of Jewish traitors?
That's difficult to say. There was a very small number of Jewish people involved in the betrayal who did so on a very regular basis. The most famous example of this type is Ans van Dijk, who was the only woman to be executed in the Netherlands after the war. In my view, Ans van Dijk was insane. I mean, she acted in a permanent state of panic, which she had been brought in by the Dutch policeman Cate, who ran her as an agent. I feel it was a serious mistake that, during her trial, there was no examination of her by a psychiatrist, although her Jewish lawyer by the name of Bottenheim felt that that was needed and tried to persuade the court to have her examined by a psychiatrist. So the number of Jewish betrayers would be, say, some tens of Jewish betrayers, 10, 20, perhaps 30. It's a small number, of course, and we will never be able to tell in another way than this estimate, because people who betray tend to take their secrets into their graves. The only cases in which I, as an historian, have been able to convince myself that I had solved a case involved the betrayal of Jews were in the cases in which the betrayer would have appeared in a Dutch courtroom after the liberation, and he or she would have been convicted for particular cases of betrayal. But even in these cases, the court records only give us part of the reality, because from the point of view of law, say against a person like Ans van Dijk, it wasn't necessary to confront her with all of the cases of her betrayal. From the point of view of law, when you can make it credible in a court of law that somebody has betrayed in 5 or 6 cases, that's more than sufficient for a death penalty.
Yeah.
So even in these cases, and to add one thing, in 1994, I know so specifically because I will never forget, I had a very long conversation with an Amsterdam Jewish man who came from the proletariat. He explained that he was absolutely sure that he had stayed in the apartment flat of the noted Jewish betrayer Ans van Dijk, and that she did not betray him. She liked him. I mean, even such a person who is in a permanent state of panic and fears deportation if she does not hand over enough Jews as prisoners to Dutch and German policemen. Even Ans, in her state of panic, was a human being who could feel sympathy for somebody and not turn him in. Right. It's one of the more incredible war stories I just meant. And because I could not believe that story, I'm absolutely sure that it happened as I'm just telling you.
What I'm trying to find out with the numbers, Professor, is how big was the chance, so to speak, that the traitor of the Frank family was Jewish. So a lot of Jewish traders, were there just a small number? If it was
as I explained to you, the actual number was small, but the Jews who were involved in this business, up to a point, were professional, which meant that they made relatively many casualties.
So that would mean that if the current alleged perpetrator of the Frank family, the one mentioned in the book, would probably not have had only the Frank family as
exactly
right, and we have no signs of that at all.
Right? At all, because no. I mean, it's very logical from a German and Dutch police point of view. When you can run a Jew to do betrayal for you, you would lean on him or her in such a way, and you will not let go.
Yep.
And of course, the story of the cold case team is very far away from these historical facts which now I'm mentioning to you. If Van den Berg would have been one of these professional betrayers, we would have known so since 1945. I mean, Evelyn, Amsterdam is not a big city. I will try to give you some more details. Some of this very small group of German perpetrators were given a particular exemption from deportation, which was called a 120,000 stamp. It's a number which is put in your passport at the time. Now these temporary exemptions also were for sale. So if you would give the Germans 50,000 guilders apiece per family member, you would be able to buy such a temporary exemption. So this only was for the very rich. Now, the same stamp of 120,000 also was given to this very small group of Jewish betrayers. Beginning, I believe, in 1953, the German government decided that it wanted to compensate the people who had bought these very expensive exemptions. There was a committee, and I've had the pleasure and privilege of being personal friends with two of the three members of that committee. One was my former colleague Hans van der Leeuw, and the other was one of the sons of Abraham Ascher by the name of Louis Ascher, Lodewijk. Lodewijk had been living in Amsterdam for a longer period of time than many other Jews because he was the supervisor of the local diamond factory of the Ascher family. So he slept there alone in that empty factory building. And because Lodewijk had been living in Amsterdam for such a long time, the German government in 1953 and my colleague van der Leeuw, of course, rightfully guessed that Lodewijk would have heard the name of the Jewish betrayers and that he would be able to explain to the German government that in these cases it was not very wise to compensate them for funds they had not given to the Germans. The point of the story is Amsterdam was a small town. The simple presence and the fact that Louis Ascher was willing to work on this committee and to tell what he knew about the professional betrayers of Jews. Had he known that Van den Berg had been one of them, he would have told us immediately after the liberation.
Right.
I think that's very, very telling. And before I ask the next question, I'd like to just add for our listeners, if anyone would like to know more about the pressure that was put on Jews to catch other Jews, there's a book called Stella by Peter Wyden, W-Y-D-E-N,
Right.
which I have read, and it is actually about his friend. He got out of Germany in time. He was a teenager, but this is his friend from school. And when you read it, you will really understand the pressure that she was under, first to try and save her mother. I'm not sure about her father, and then herself. And also clearly there's, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but there's mental illness. I mean,
absolutely.
Wyden is very careful. But
in such a position, it's practically impossible to remain sane.
So if the investigating team had read this book, Stella, because the Berlin situation was very much the way you describe Amsterdam, they might have had a better understanding.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's just move to the Dutch in general, who have a reputation of being mostly good towards the Dutch Jews during the German occupation. Do the facts justify that reputation?
No, unfortunately, the facts do not justify this victim. Historically speaking, of course, anti-Semitism in the Netherlands was not rampant. We have a tradition of tolerance in the 17th century, but we somewhere along the way lost that tradition. In the 18th and 19th century, there were anti-Jewish sentiments, but there also was equality before the law since the 1780s, since Napoleonic times. But although very many Jews were highly assimilated, and perhaps in some cases even felt more Dutch than Jewish in all possible varieties, actually in as many varieties as there were individual Jews. There were 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands who, each and every one of them, had their own mix of Jewishness and Dutchness, in a way. Now, the hard truth is that, relatively speaking, although virulent anti-Semitism was lacking, more Jews were deported from occupied Holland than they were deported from occupied Belgium or from France. And these statistics are tragic and sad. In the Dutch case, 75% of the Jews was deported. In the Belgian case, 60% was deported. No, I have to correct myself, say about half, and then 60% of the Jews of Antwerp was deported, and about a lower percentage in the city of Brussels. And in France, all in all, 25% of Jewry was deported. And the specific thing about the French case is that the French Jews were protected by the French authorities, and that the non-French Jews were handed over to the Germans. So, but all in all, there was more solidarity in Belgium and in France than there was in the Netherlands. So no, although Anne Frank after no probability is the most famous Holocaust survivor, and because although Anne Frank never gives up believing in humanity and in mankind, unfortunately, the reputation of being mostly good towards the Jews is not justified by the historical track record.
If I might ask you a question about that.
Sure.
Is it true that you just explained that the Dutch did not save more Jews? They saved less Jews percentage-wise than other countries in Europe did. Is it true that they also didn't actively help the Germans in general to find Jews? That's one question. The other question is it true that, I would say in defense of the Dutch in this discussion, the type of occupation by the Nazis was different?
Sure, no, the type of occupational rules and government certainly plays a role. In the Dutch occupational structure, the representatives of the Waffen-SS, of the SS, and the party were relatively influential. That was not the case in Belgium and in France, because there were military governments in these cases. On the other hand, there are also examples of German military governments being very anti-Jewish. Say, for instance, on the Balkans or in Greece. So that, all in all, does not explain everything. One of the things important in the evaluation of the Dutch is, of course, that the Dutch lacked historical experiences of occupation. That was different in Belgium and in France.
Right.
There, people had an experience and had previous experiences of the necessity of going underground and of behaving in a clandestine and illegal way. And these traditions, coming from the occupations in the First World War, were totally lacking in the Netherlands. Also, the approach that also non-Jewish citizens in Belgium and France have towards their own government is different than in the Dutch case. In France and in Belgium, in very wide circles of society, there's a very active distrust of the government. In the Dutch case, very many Dutch persons perhaps were overly legalistic and felt that it was in a way not allowed to act against the Nazi occupiers. And perhaps up to a point, many Dutchmen were naive and could not see these criminals for what they really were. So all of these factors may play a role and have played a role in the Dutch case. There is, however, one other thing which should not be forgotten. All over Europe, the percentage of non-Jews who are willing to take Jews into their own home is low. All over Europe, Raoul Hilberg has made this calculation. He is the founding father of Holocaust studies. Hilberg said, all over Europe, this percentage is 1%. So 1% of the non-Jews is willing to take a Jew into their home. The only exception is Paris, where the percentage is 3%. That's the highest level in Europe. It also meant that the relative size of a Jewish community was of great importance. The Jewish community of Copenhagen is very small, so that 1% of the Danish non-Jews who were willing to help a Danish Jew, that 1% does the trick in Copenhagen. That same 1%, which meant the total rescue of the Copenhagen Jews, meant total catastrophe in the context of Warsaw, where there are 8,000 inhabitants, 400,000 of them were Jews, and there are no more than 4,000 hiding places, because in Warsaw also that 1% rule applied. So there are wide variations in the intensity of anti-Semitism all over Europe. But you should take other factors into account as well. And one of these factors is the relative size of a Jewish community. And you also have to take into account how long the period was that they were threatened, which in the Dutch case is long.
Yes.
It's close to 3 years, which gave the German and the Dutch police plenty of time to try to make efforts to find the Jews who had gone into hiding. In other cases, the period of occupation and of direct threat to Jews is shorter, which of course meant that your chances of survival were higher.
Interesting. There's all those aspects that played a role.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's what you get when you ask historians, you know, we take every opportunity we can to make the past as complicated as we possibly can. It's what we do.
I learned a great deal.
Yeah.
Evelyn?
From your years of studying the Holocaust, do you have recommendations of actions needed now to prevent something similar happening again in Europe or elsewhere?
I don't think that I can put it any better than Professor Yehuda Bauer of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Yad Vashem has put it. And the Holocaust has happened, and therefore it can happen again. And then Yehuda always adds, so thou shalt not be a victim, thou shalt not be a perpetrator, but above all, thou shalt not be a bystander. And of course, the tragic truth of the matter is that very many of us, in fact, are bystanders in witnessing the genocides of today. But that's not a reason not to make the effort, by the way.
Exactly. And do you have any last words before we wrap up this incredibly fascinating conversation?
No, I'm very grateful and it's very kind of you to have me. if I can be of any help in the future, please, well, do let me know. And if people would come to you with questions, please feel free to give them my email, and I will do my best to give as good as a reply as I possibly can.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for that.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
So thank you for everything. Thank our listeners for listening. I do hope particularly that this podcast is shared as widely as possible because of the book that we've been talking about. And I just think that people really need to understand much more than what the press has been talking about in terms of accusing someone who cannot defend himself, and also the research. I mean, even the team says, it wouldn't stand up in court. I think this is really important to mention that
Yeah, sure.
Prosecution could not get a conviction. And so I think we need to be really careful about letting people think that this book is the truth and without any reservations. So whatever any of us can do to kind of have conversations, not yell, but have conversations about, let's think about what this really means in the terms of what was going on at the time. Do check out Evelyn's documentary, Never Again Is Now, which has a great deal of the Netherlands in it. You can see it on YouTube and Amazon, and you can read more about my play project at thinedgeofthewedge.com. And as we end every program by saying, if you can do this without putting yourself in physical harm, please speak up against anti-Semitism and hate.
I couldn't